The man staring at me from the darkness had my face. That's the sentence I still hear in my head whenever I think about the night everything changed. My name is Ethan Cole, and until that moment I believed my life had already settled into something predictable. I worked a steady job about 40 miles outside our hometown, rented a small apartment above a hardware store, and called my family just often enough to convince myself nothing too strange was happening back there. Families drift apart sometimes. That's what I told myself. What I didn't know was that while I was measuring distance in miles, my twin brother Evan was measuring time in something much colder, days, weeks, and years spent locked away in a place no one was supposed to look. It started with a phone call that didn't make sense. A quiet voice from a number I didn't recognize said only one thing before hanging up. Check the shed. That was it. No explanation. Just those 3 words. Now, if you've ever grown up in a small American town, you know every old property has a shed somewhere behind it. Rusted hinges, leaning wood, maybe an old lawnmower inside. Nothing important. The shed behind our family house was like that too, sitting about 30 yards past the back fence, half hidden by cottonwood trees. I hadn't walked near it in years. But something about that call kept rattling around in my mind all evening until I finally grabbed my truck keys and drove the 40 miles back to the place I'd tried so hard to leave behind. The house looked the same when I pulled up just after midnight. Same porch light glowing yellow. Same gravel driveway crunching under the tires. Everything quiet. Too quiet. I remember standing there for a second, telling myself the call had to be a prank. Some wrong number. Some stupid joke. But the closer I walked toward that shed, the heavier the air felt. The door was locked with a thick metal latch that definitely hadn't been there when we were kids. I don't know why, but I knocked first. Just once. The sound echoed through the wood like it didn't belong there. For a moment nothing happened. Then I heard movement inside. Slow. Careful. Like someone who wasn't sure if they should make a sound at all. My hand moved before my brain caught up. I slid the latch open and pulled the door back maybe a foot. The smell of old wood and dust drifted out into the cool night air. And then I saw him. At first my mind couldn't process what my eyes were seeing. A thin man sitting on a narrow cot inside the shed, blinking against the porch lights spilling through the doorway. Same brown hair. Same jawline. Same scar above the eyebrow from when we were 10 and crashed our bikes on the county road. My reflection, just older and worn down by something I couldn't name yet. Evan looked at me the way a man looks at daylight after a long winter. He didn't shout. Didn't move fast. He just said my name in a quiet voice that barely carried past the door. Ethan, you came back. And in that moment I realized 2 things at once. First, my twin brother had been hidden here for a very long time. And second, someone in our own family had made sure no one ever asked where he went. I did not step inside right away. For a few seconds I just stood there with the door half open, my hand still on the metal latch, staring at a man who looked exactly like me but somehow, older than the calendar said he should be. Evan had always been the stronger one when we were kids. Same height, same build. But he had that steady calm that made teachers trust him and neighbors smile when he waved. The man sitting on that narrow cot did not look like the Evan I remembered. His shoulders were thinner, his face hollow in a way that only comes from long seasons without sunlight. Still, his eyes were the same. Brown. Sharp. Watching me carefully, like he was making sure I was real. I took one slow step inside the shed. The wood floor creaked under my boots, and the sound seemed too loud for the small space. There was a metal water jug in the corner, a small battery lantern, and a folded blanket on the cot. That was it. No windows. No clock. Nothing that could tell a man what day it was or how long he had been sitting there. Evan, I said quietly, because suddenly speaking felt strange, like I was interrupting something sacred. He nodded. Once, slow and deliberate, as if even that small motion cost energy. For a moment neither of us spoke again. I kept looking at his face and then at my own reflection in the dusty metal lantern hanging on the wall. Twins share a strange kind of mirror with each other. You spend your whole life knowing exactly how the other person will look 10 years from now, because you see it in the bathroom mirror every morning. But the version of my face sitting in front of me had lived through something I had not. How long? I finally asked. My voice sounded steady, but inside my chest something had already started tightening. Evan lowered his eyes to the floorboards before answering. 4 years. The words did not come out dramatic or loud. Just simple. 4 years. I remember doing the math in my head without meaning to. 4 summers. 4 winters. Holidays, birthdays, storms, quiet mornings. 4 entire cycles of life happening outside while my brother sat inside a 12 by 12 wooden shed behind the house where we grew up. Why did nobody say anything? I asked. That question had already begun forming the moment I opened the door. Our town was not the kind of place where people disappear quietly. Someone always notices when a truck stops showing up in the driveway or when a man stops buying coffee at the gas station every morning. Evan looked back up at me then, and the expression on his face was not anger. It was something colder. Something that had been sitting there for a long time. Because they were told not to ask, he said. I felt the air shift in that tiny room. Those words carried weight. They meant this was not an accident. Not some misunderstanding where someone locked the wrong door and forgot the key. This had been arranged. Planned. Maintained. I leaned against the door frame because suddenly my legs felt less steady than they had a minute earlier. Who? I asked. Evan held my gaze for a long moment before answering, and when he finally spoke the name it did not sound like an accusation. It sounded like a fact that had already settled into the ground. Tyler, he said quietly. My son. I did not answer right away. The name sat in the air between us like something heavy that had been waiting years to be spoken out loud. Tyler. I repeated it quietly in my head because my mind refused to place it where Evan had just placed it. Tyler was 12 the last time I saw him regularly. A skinny kid who used to ride his bike down the gravel road behind our house and ask too many questions about everything. He used to follow Evan everywhere, like most sons follow their fathers when they are young. I remember teaching him how to throw a baseball in the front yard one summer afternoon, the sun beating down on the dry grass while Evan laughed every time the ball rolled past the fence. That was the version of Tyler my mind kept trying to hold on to. But time does not freeze people the way memory does. 4 years can turn a child into a man. And apparently it can also turn a son into something else entirely. I stepped deeper into the shed and pulled the door halfway closed behind me, not to trap us inside but to keep the cool night air from carrying our voices too far across the yard. The lantern hanging on the wall cast a dull yellow glow that made the small room feel even smaller. You are telling me Tyler did this? I asked slowly, making sure I had heard him correctly. Evan did not answer immediately. He looked down at his hands resting on his knees, fingers thin but steady. When he finally spoke again, his voice carried the same quiet certainty as before. He did not start it alone, he said. But he made sure it kept happening. I felt a slow chill move through my chest. That sentence meant layers. It meant there had been conversations I never heard, decisions made in rooms I had not walked into for years. Explain, I said. Evan leaned back slightly against the wooden wall of the shed, as if organizing memories that had been stored carefully in his mind for a long time. The first year after you left town, he began, things were normal. Tyler was finishing high school. I was still running the property and the equipment the same way our father did before us. I nodded without speaking. Our family land stretched across almost 40 acres outside town, mostly fields and a few old barns that had been standing longer than any of us. It was not a fortune, but in a small place like ours it was enough to matter. Evan continued. Then Tyler started talking about selling pieces of the land. He said developers were already looking at property along the highway. Said we could make real money if we moved fast. I could almost hear Tyler's voice saying those words. Ambitious. Confident. A little impatient. You did not agree, I said. Evan shook his head once. No. That land had been in the family for 3 generations. I told him we would think about it slowly. Maybe lease some sections, but not sell everything. The lantern flickered softly against the wall while he spoke. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwood leaves with a low rustling sound that filled the pauses between sentences. Tyler did not like that answer, Evan said quietly. And that is when the conversation started changing. I felt the weight of what he was building toward before he even finished saying it. Somewhere between those conversations about land and money, something had shifted in Tyler's mind. Something that eventually ended with a metal latch on the outside of this shed and 4 years disappearing from my brother's life. I took a slow breath and looked around the small room again. A cot. A lantern. A water jug. 4 years reduced to objects you could count with one hand. Why did he think he could get away with it? I asked. Evan looked at me carefully then, and for the first time since I arrived, a faint expression crossed his face that looked almost like understanding. Because, he said slowly, he believed nobody would ever come back to check. I stood there for a long moment after Evan said those words, letting them settle in the quiet air of that shed. Because he believed nobody would ever come back to check. The sentence carried a strange kind of truth. When people leave small towns, they rarely look back often enough to see what changed behind them. Life moves fast in other places. Jobs, bills, new routines. You assume the people back home are still living the same steady rhythm they always did. I had told myself that story for years. I worked. I paid rent. I called on holidays. I convinced myself distance was normal. Standing there in that 12 by 12 room, I realized distance can also become a blindfold. I leaned against the wooden wall, the boards cool through my jacket, and tried to imagine the first day this had happened. The first moment Evan understood he was not simply having an argument with his son about property or money. The first moment he realized the door was not going to open again the way it used to. Tell me how it started, I said quietly. Evan took a slow breath before answering. His eyes drifted toward the door as if he could still see the yard outside the way it looked 4 years earlier. Tyler started bringing paperwork home, he said. Surveys, development proposals, letters from investors who wanted land near the highway. He talked about subdivisions, storage facilities, warehouses. Said the town was growing and we were sitting on opportunity. I could picture Tyler at the kitchen table spreading out those papers. Our farmhouse kitchen had always been the center of every serious conversation in the family. Old oak table, coffee mugs, sunlight through the window facing the fields. Evan continued speaking in that calm voice that never rose above a steady level. At first I thought he was just excited about the future. A lot of young people want to build something bigger than what they grew up with. I did not blame him for that. But the conversations stopped being discussions. They became pressure. The lantern hummed softly beside us while he talked. Outside, a truck passed somewhere on the county road, the distant sound reminding me that the world had kept moving while Evan's life stayed frozen in this small building. He said the land was wasted sitting under crops and old barns. Evan went on. He said if I did not sign the agreements he would find someone else who would convince me. I frowned slightly. Someone else? Evan nodded. Investors. Lawyers. People who told him patience was the same thing as weakness. I felt something tighten in my chest again. It was not just about land anymore. It was about influence. About voices whispering in a young man's ear that the fastest path to success is removing whatever stands in the way. Then one afternoon, Evan said, Tyler asked me to walk out here with him. He said he wanted to show me a place where we could build a new equipment shed if the property expanded. Evan looked around the small room as he finished that sentence. The same walls. The same door. The same place where that walk had ended. I stepped inside to look at the measurements he had marked on the floor. Evan continued. And when I turned around, the door closed behind me. The way he said it was almost gentle, like describing a door shutting during a quiet evening breeze. But the meaning landed heavily in my mind. One step inside. one door closing, and 4 years disappearing from the outside world. I remember the way Evan looked at the door after saying that. Not with anger. Not even with fear. Just with the quiet understanding of a man who had replayed the same moment in his mind 1,000 times. I tried to picture it myself. A warm afternoon. The sound of gravel under boots. A father stepping into a small wooden shed because his son wanted to show him something about future plans. Then the sound of the latch sliding into place. A simple metal click that no one outside the yard would have noticed. "What did you do?" I asked quietly. Evan gave a small shrug that seemed too calm for the story he was telling. "At first I thought it was a mistake," he said. I knocked on the door and told him it was not funny. The lantern light flickered softly while he spoke, casting long shadows across the wooden walls. He did not answer right away. I could hear him moving outside, pacing in the dirt. Then he said something through the door that I will never forget. Evan paused for a moment, as if deciding whether the memory deserved to be spoken again. He said the farm needed a different future. Evan continued. He said the town was growing and I was standing in the way of opportunity. I let out a slow breath through my nose. The words sounded exactly like something Tyler would say after too many conversations with people who only see land as numbers on paper. "You told him to open the door," I said. Evan nodded once. "Of course. I told him this was ridiculous. I told him to stop playing games and come back inside the house so we could talk like family." He looked down at the wooden floor again. But he did not open it. The silence that followed felt heavier than the story itself. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwood trees again, brushing the leaves together in a soft, restless sound. I could not stop imagining the hours that must have followed that first conversation through the closed door. "Did he come back later?" I asked. Evan gave a slow nod. "Yes. That evening he returned with a cooler of food and water. He slid it through the door and said we would talk again when I was ready to reconsider the property agreements." I stared at him, trying to understand the logic behind something that did not belong to any normal conversation between a father and son. "He thought this would change your mind," I said. Evan looked up at me again, and for the first time I saw something in his eyes that was not calm. It was not rage either. It was disappointment. Deep and quiet. "He believed time would make me tired," Evan said. "He believed isolation would turn stubbornness into agreement." I felt my jaw tighten slightly. 4 years. 4 years of a man waiting for a door to open while the world outside continued negotiating his life without him. "And the town?" I asked after a moment. "Nobody noticed you were gone?" Evan leaned his head back against the wooden wall. "Tyler told people I had left to travel," he said. "Said I wanted a quiet break from the farm. Said I was staying with friends out of state." I shook my head slowly, the realization spreading through my mind like cold water. In a small town, a simple story repeated often enough becomes truth. If Tyler said Evan was away, most people would accept it. They would wave at the empty driveway and assume the truck would return eventually. I looked around the shed again, taking in every small detail with new understanding. The cot. The lantern. The jug of water. None of it looked temporary anymore. It looked prepared. Maintained. Designed for patience. I turned back to Evan and asked the question that had been sitting in my chest since the moment he spoke Tyler's name. "If he wanted you to sign papers," I said slowly, "why did he keep you here for 4 years?" Evan studied my face carefully before answering. "Because after the first few months," he said quietly, "he realized something important." I frowned slightly. "What?" Evan's voice dropped lower, almost thoughtful. "He realized the farm was worth far more if the owner was never able to return." I let those words sit in the air for a moment because the meaning behind them was impossible to ignore. If the owner never returned, the land would eventually fall into someone else's control. Not by force. Not by loud conflict. Just through paperwork, time, and a story repeated often enough that people stopped questioning it. I looked around the shed again, seeing it differently now. Not just a place to hold someone temporarily, but a place designed to remove a person from the outside world slowly and quietly. So what did he tell people after the first year? I asked. Evan shifted slightly on the cot before answering. At first he said I was traveling. He said. Then he started telling people I had decided to stay away longer. Said I was thinking about retiring somewhere quiet. I frowned. People believe that. Evan gave a small nod. Most of them did. In a town like ours, folks do not push too hard into someone else's family business. If a son says his father is taking time off, people usually accept it. I knew he was right. Our town had always run on a kind of polite distance. Everyone knows each other, but no one wants to be the person asking questions that might make a neighbor uncomfortable. Tyler had counted on that silence. I leaned my shoulder against the wooden wall again, trying to organize everything I was hearing. For years. Stories told to the town. Papers about selling land. Investors waiting somewhere beyond the county line. Did he ever bring those agreements back? I asked. Evan nodded slowly. Many times. The lantern hummed softly as he continued speaking. Every few weeks he would come out here with another folder. Sometimes he talked calmly, like a businessman explaining a deal. Other times he sounded frustrated, like he could not understand why I refused to cooperate. I studied his face carefully. And you never signed anything? Evan shook his head once. No. Because the moment I did, the land would no longer belong to the family. It would belong to whoever Tyler decided to sell it to. The weight of that decision sat clearly in his voice. Not stubbornness. Not pride. Just a man holding the line for something that had existed long before either of us were born. I glanced toward the door again. From the outside it probably looked like nothing more than an old farm shed. Weathered boards. A crooked roof. A forgotten building behind a house that had stood there for decades. Nobody driving past on the county road would think twice about it. That was the part that unsettled me the most. Everything about this place depended on how ordinary it looked. Did Tyler ever worry someone would check on you? I asked after a moment. Evan let out a quiet breath. Not really. Because he made sure the one person who might ask questions stayed far away. I met his eyes. Me. Evan gave a slight nod. He knew you left town to build your own life. He knew you did not visit often. And when people asked about you, he told them you were busy in the city and had no plans to return anytime soon. I felt a slow realization settle in my chest. Tyler had not only removed his father from the picture. He had also built a story around my absence to make sure the circle stayed closed. So the whole thing depended on one assumption. I said quietly. Evan watched me carefully. What assumption? I took a slow breath before answering. That I would never walk back through that yard again. I could see the moment the realization settled in Evan's eyes. Not surprise. Not excitement. Just a quiet shift, like a man adjusting the direction of a long thought. For 4 years he had been sitting inside that shed believing the outside world had already moved past him. And now I was standing there in the doorway, proof that one small crack had appeared in the story Tyler built. I stepped back toward the door and looked out across the yard. The farmhouse porch light was still on, casting a pale circle over the gravel driveway. The same porch light our father used to leave on every night when we were kids, saying a home should always look welcoming after dark. Seeing it now made something feel strange in my chest. That light had been glowing out there every night, while Evan sat inside this building 30 yards away. Does Tyler know I am here? I asked. Evan shook his head. Slowly. No. If he knew you were coming, this door would not have been locked with a simple latch. I understood what he meant immediately. Everything about this situation depended on quiet control. A story told calmly. A routine that never changed enough to attract attention. If Tyler thought someone was about to question that routine, he would have adjusted the plan long before I stepped onto the property tonight. I turned back toward Evan. When does he usually come out here? I asked. Evan glanced toward the lantern hanging beside the wall. Late morning most days. Sometimes again after sunset. He brings supplies and checks if I have changed my mind about the paperwork. I nodded slowly while absorbing the pattern. Tyler believed the situation was stable. Predictable. Managed. That assumption was the only reason the shed door had opened tonight without resistance. I walked back to the cot and sat down on the wooden crate beside it. For a few seconds neither of us spoke. The quiet was not uncomfortable. It felt more like two people thinking through the same problem from opposite sides. Finally Evan spoke again. "You should not stay here long," he said quietly. "If Tyler sees your truck in the driveway tomorrow, he will start asking questions." I gave a small nod because he was right. My truck parked in the open gravel drive would not stay unnoticed once daylight came. But leaving immediately did not feel like the right move either. Too much had changed tonight. Too many pieces of the story had finally come into view. I leaned forward slightly and looked at Evan carefully. "Listen to me," I said. "Tyler built this whole situation on one belief. He believes the world has already accepted the version of events he told them." Evan watched me closely but said nothing yet. "He believes the town thinks you are gone," I continued. "He believes the property decisions are only waiting for the right moment. And most importantly, he believes the only person who might challenge that story stayed away." Evan tilted his head slightly as if following where my thoughts were going. "You," he said. I nodded once. "Exactly." For the first time that night I felt something shift inside my mind from confusion to strategy. Tyler had built a plan based on absence. Absence of questions. Absence of witnesses. Absence of family returning. At the wrong time. I looked around the small shed again and then back at Evan's face, which still mirrored my own in the lantern light. Twins share more than appearance. Sometimes they share timing. And suddenly a very clear idea settled into place. "What if," I said slowly, "the person Tyler expects to see tomorrow morning is not the person he thinks he locked in here?" Evan studied me in silence for several seconds before answering. Then he asked the one question that mattered. "You are thinking about switching places, are you not?" The moment Evan said the words out loud, the idea no longer felt like a passing thought. It became a plan sitting between us in the dim lantern light. Twins grow up hearing the same joke their entire lives. Teachers mix them up. Neighbors call the wrong name across the street. Photographs confuse relatives at family gatherings. Most of the time it is harmless. Sometimes it is even funny. But there are rare moments when that shared face becomes something else entirely. A key. Evan leaned forward slightly on the cot, studying my expression with the careful attention only someone who has known you since the day you were born can manage. "You understand what that would mean," he said quietly. "If Tyler believes you are me, he will continue acting exactly the way he has been acting." I nodded slowly. "That is the point." The wind outside brushed through the cottonwood branches again, and the soft sound carried through the cracks in the wooden walls. The farm looked peaceful at night. Anyone standing on the porch would think the land was resting quietly under the stars. No one would imagine that two identical brothers were sitting in a shed planning the first real disruption to a 4-year lie. Evan glanced toward the door again, thinking carefully. "You would have to stay here until morning," he said. "He usually comes after breakfast. Around 9 or 10. I checked the watch on my wrist. It was a little past midnight. That left several hours before daylight reached the yard. "That gives us time," I said. Evan frowned slightly. "Time for what?" I looked around the shed once more, committing every detail to memory. The cot. The lantern. The position of the water jug in the corner. The way the door latch slid into place from the outside. "Time for me to understand how you have been living here," I said. "If I am going to sit in this room tomorrow and convince Tyler nothing has changed, I need to know exactly what his routine looks like." Evan studied me in silence for a moment. Then he gave a slow nod, the first sign that he was beginning to accept the idea. "He expects quiet," Evan explained. "He brings supplies and usually talks about the property for a few minutes, Sometimes he asks if I am ready to sign the agreements. When I say no, he reminds me that time is not on my side. I listened carefully to every detail. The tone of Tyler's voice. The questions he asked. The way he tried to make patience sound like defeat. Evan had been studying those patterns for 4 years. Now those observations were about to become our advantage. Does he ever come inside? I asked. Evan shook his head. Rarely. Most of the time he stands at the doorway and talks. He prefers the distance. That detail mattered more than anything else. Distance meant shadows. Distance meant Tyler would see my face only in pieces of light and darkness. Twins do not need perfect lighting to pass for each other. Evan leaned forward again. If we do this, he said slowly, you will be stepping into a story he believes he controls. I met his gaze without hesitation. Exactly, I said. And the best way to understand a lie is to let the person who created it keep talking. For the first time since I opened the shed door, a faint expression crossed Evan's face that looked almost like hope. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just the quiet possibility that the next morning might unfold very differently than Tyler expected. The rest of that night moved slowly, but every minute mattered. Evan walked me through the small routines that had defined his life inside the shed for the past 4 years. He explained where Tyler usually placed the cooler when he brought supplies, how long he stayed near the doorway, and how the conversations always circled back to the same subject. Land. Agreements. Signatures. The lantern light grew dimmer as the hours passed, and outside the wind softened until the entire property felt still. I listened carefully, repeating certain details back to Evan so I would remember them. Exactly the way Tyler expected them to happen. The tone of voice. The pauses. The way Evan usually answered when Tyler asked the same question again and again. By the time the sky outside began to lighten slightly through the cracks in the wood, the plan no longer felt uncertain. It felt precise. Evan stood slowly from the cot and stretched his legs, testing his balance. For years inside a room changes the way a man moves, but there was determination in his posture now that had not been there when I first opened the door. You should leave before daylight reaches the yard, I said quietly. If Tyler sees you walking across the property, everything ends before it begins. Evan nodded. He understood the risk as clearly as I did. We stepped outside together for a moment, the cool morning air brushing across the fields. The horizon had begun to glow faint orange behind the distant tree line, the first signal that the town would soon wake up to another ordinary day. Evan looked across the land that had been his responsibility for most of his adult life. The barn stood silent. The gravel driveway stretched toward the county road. From a distance, nothing about the farm suggested anything had ever been wrong. That was the illusion Tyler had depended on. Evan turned back toward me and studied my face carefully. For a second it felt like looking into a mirror that carried the same history but had walked a different road. You will have to be patient, he said quietly. Tyler talks more than he realizes when he believes he is in control. I gave a small nod. That is exactly what I am counting on. Evan stepped toward the edge of the trees where the shadows were still thick enough to hide his movement. Before disappearing into the darker part of the property, he stopped once more and looked back. There was no dramatic speech. No long goodbye. Just a quiet understanding between two brothers who shared the same face and now shared the same purpose. 9 or 10, he reminded me softly. Then he was gone among the cottonwoods, leaving the yard empty again. I returned to the shed and closed the door behind me, sliding the latch into the same position Tyler expected to find it later that morning. The cot creaked slightly as I sat down, letting the silence settle around me. For the first time since arriving, I allowed myself to imagine the next few hours from Tyler's perspective. He would walk across the yard carrying his usual cooler. He would open the latch the same way he had done hundreds of times before. And when he spoke through the doorway, he would believe he was speaking to the same man he had controlled for 4 years. The difference was that this time, someone was finally listening with a very different plan. The morning arrived slowly, the way quiet mornings always do on farmland. First the faint gray light slipping through the narrow cracks between the boards. Then the distant sound of a truck passing somewhere along the county road. Finally the soft rustle of wind moving across the dry grass behind the barns. I sat on the cot exactly the way Evan had described he usually did, shoulders slightly forward, hands resting loosely together, eyes lowered toward the floor. The lantern had burned out hours earlier, leaving the inside of the shed dim but not completely dark. Enough light crept in from outside to shape the outline of the door and the metal latch that would soon move. Waiting is a strange thing. When you know something important is about to happen, every small sound feels louder than it should. A bird landing on the roof. Gravel shifting under tires in the distance. The creak of wood adjusting to the morning temperature. Each noise made my attention sharpen, then settle again when the moment passed. Evan had said Tyler usually arrived between 9 and 10. I did not know which end of that window he would choose today, but the pattern mattered less than the assumption behind it. Tyler believed the man inside this shed was predictable. Quiet. Tired. Eventually willing to give up. That belief was about to guide every move he made. Around mid-morning I heard the first real signal. The low hum of an engine turning off near the house. Then a car door closing somewhere across the yard. I kept my posture exactly the same, resisting the instinct to turn toward the sound. Evan had told me Tyler often watched the shed for a few seconds before approaching, as if checking that everything remained exactly the way he left it. A minute passed. Maybe 2. Then I heard footsteps on gravel moving closer. Slow. Unhurried. The kind of walk a person takes when they believe the situation is already under control. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. For a moment there was silence again, the quiet pause of someone preparing to start a familiar conversation. Then the metal latch shifted. The sound was small but unmistakable. A short scrape of steel against wood, followed by the soft lift of the handle. The door opened a few inches, letting a thin blade of sunlight cut across the dusty floorboards. I kept my head slightly lowered, just as Evan said he usually did. From the corner of my eye I saw the outline of a man standing in the doorway, one shoulder leaning casually against the frame. Tyler had grown since the last time I saw him years earlier. His voice confirmed it a second later. Deeper. More confident. "Morning," he said, as if greeting a neighbor across a fence rather than the man he had kept hidden from the world. I did not answer right away. Evan had explained that silence often made Tyler talk more. The cooler slid across the floor toward the wall with a dull scrape. "You slept all right?" Tyler continued, his tone calm, almost conversational. "Weather stayed pretty mild last night." I lifted my head slightly but did not fully face him, keeping my expression shadowed by the light behind his shoulders. My voice came out quieter than usual, shaped carefully to match the rhythm Evan described. "It was fine," I said. Tyler exhaled softly, the sound of someone settling into a conversation he believed would end the same way it always had. Papers rustled in his hand. "Good," he said. "Because I brought something new today. I think this time you might finally see why holding on to that land does not make sense anymore." Tyler stayed in the doorway instead of stepping fully inside, just like Evan had described. Sunlight from behind him stretched across the shed floor in a narrow strip that stopped a few feet from the cot where I sat. That distance worked in my favor. He could see my outline, the shape of my shoulders, the way I held my head slightly down, but not every detail of my face. Papers rustled again as he flipped through the folder in his hand. "You know," he said in a calm voice, "I have been thinking about our last conversation. I realized maybe I have been explaining this the wrong way." I kept my gaze lowered, letting a few seconds pass before responding. Evan had told me Tyler filled silence with words if he believed he was close to winning. "Maybe," I said quietly. Tyler shifted his weight against the door frame. "It is not about selling the farm just because developers want it," he continued. "It is about making sure the land actually works for the family instead of sitting here doing the same thing it did 30 years ago." I heard the confidence in his tone. The certainty of someone who had repeated the same argument enough times to believe it completely. The cooler lid opened with a soft plastic click, and he slid a bottle of water across the floor toward the corner where Evan usually kept them. There are investors interested in building storage units along the highway, Tyler said. The town council already approved new zoning 2 miles down the road. Once construction starts there, property values around here will jump. I lifted my head slightly, still keeping most of my face turned away from the light. And that means selling everything, I replied slowly. Tyler sighed, the way someone does when they believe they are explaining something obvious. Not everything, he said. Just the sections that matter most to them. More papers shifted in his hands. Look, I brought updated offers today. These numbers are higher than anything we have seen before. He stepped half a pace closer to the doorway, enough for the sunlight to catch the edge of the folder. I noticed the way he held it carefully, like the documents inside represented more than just business deals. They represented the future he had already imagined for himself. All it takes is your signature, he said. I remained silent again, letting the words hang there. A minute earlier he had sounded relaxed. Now there was a hint of impatience under his voice. You know this cannot go on forever, Tyler continued. At some point you have to accept that things change. I let out a slow breath, exactly the way Evan said he usually did when Tyler pushed too hard. Some things should not change, I said quietly. Tyler laughed under his breath, not angry, just dismissive. You always say that. His tone softened slightly, almost persuasive. But you also know time moves whether we like it or not. Investors do not wait forever, and neither does opportunity. He leaned his shoulder against the door frame again, settling back into the conversation he thought he understood. Think about it, he added. A few signatures and everything becomes easier. The land finally works for us. The town grows. Everyone wins. I slowly raised my eyes just enough to watch his outline in the doorway. He still believed he was guiding the discussion exactly where he wanted it to go. And that belief was about to make him say far more than he ever planned. Tyler waited for my response, the confidence still sitting comfortably in his posture. He believed he had time. He believed the conversation would eventually reach the same place it always had, where silence meant hesitation and hesitation meant progress. I shifted slightly on the cot, letting the wood creak the same way Evan said it often did. You have been very patient about this, Tyler continued after a moment. 4 years is a long time to think about a decision. I did not answer immediately. The number hung in the air like something he had said casually, but the meaning of it was anything but casual. 4 years. 4 years he had measured like a negotiation strategy. You always believed the farm should stay exactly the way it was, Tyler added. But the world outside this place is not the same anymore. Papers rustled again as he flipped to another page in the folder. These investors already bought property along the highway. Once construction starts, this land becomes a perfect extension of that development. Storage units, equipment yards, maybe even distribution buildings. His voice carried a certain pride when he described it, like a man presenting a vision he believed would impress everyone who heard it. I have already spoken with the county about permits, he went on. They are ready to move quickly once ownership questions are settled. That sentence mattered more than the others. Ownership questions. It meant Tyler had already positioned himself in conversations where Evan's absence was treated like a temporary formality rather than a mystery. I let the silence stretch again before answering. You seem very certain about the future, I said quietly. Tyler chuckled under his breath. That is because I have been the one doing the work, he replied. Phone calls. Meetings. Negotiations. While you sat out here refusing to see what is happening around us. His tone still carried the relaxed patience of someone who believed he held every advantage. The truth is, he continued, the town already assumes the farm will eventually change hands. They know I am the one managing things now. I felt the significance of that statement immediately. Managing things now. Not helping. Not assisting. Managing. Tyler had already begun introducing himself to the outside world as the person in control of the land. People understand that older generations sometimes step away, he said, especially when they want a quieter life. He shifted slightly in the doorway, sunlight catching the edge of his shoulder. That is the story everyone believes. I slowly lifted my head just enough to watch him clearly for a second. He did not notice the difference in my expression. He was too focused on his own explanation. So eventually, Tyler continued, this conversation ends the same way it always should have. You sign the agreements, the property moves forward, and we both stop wasting time pretending the past can hold back progress. I let a breath out slowly, my voice calm when I finally answered. You are right about one thing, I said. Tyler paused, waiting. The story people believe matters, I continued quietly. Especially when the wrong story has been told for a very long time. Tyler tilted his head slightly, puzzled by the tone in my voice, but he still had not stepped close enough to see my face clearly in the light. And outside, somewhere beyond the shed and the cottonwood trees, someone else was already moving toward the yard at exactly the moment we had planned. I watched the confusion begin to move across Tyler's face, slow and uncertain, like a cloud passing over sunlight. He had noticed the difference in my voice, even if he could not yet see the reason for it. What story are you talking about? He asked. The confidence in his tone had not disappeared yet, but it had shifted slightly. I stood up from the cot then, letting the movement happen slowly so the light from the doorway finally reached my face. Tyler's eyes narrowed at first, not with recognition but with the instinctive reaction people have when something familiar suddenly feels wrong. For 4 years he had spoken to the same man sitting in the same position inside this shed. Now that man was standing differently. Looking at him differently. The story about you managing the farm, I said calmly. The story about me choosing to stay away from the world. Tyler stared at me for another second before something in his expression changed completely. His body stiffened against the door frame as the realization began catching up with him. Wait, he said slowly. The word came out quieter than before. What did you just say? I stepped forward into the thin strip of sunlight that crossed the floor. The light reached my face fully now, leaving no shadows to hide behind. For a moment Tyler simply looked at me without speaking, his mind clearly trying to reconcile two possibilities that should not exist at the same time. That story, I continued evenly, is about to change. Tyler's hand tightened slightly around the folder he was holding. You are not, he began, but the sentence never finished. Because at that exact moment another set of footsteps moved across the gravel outside the shed. The sound was steady, unhurried, and impossible to ignore. Tyler turned his head toward the yard just as the second shadow reached the doorway behind him. Evan stepped into view quietly, the morning light outlining the same face Tyler was already staring at inside the shed. For a long second nobody spoke. Tyler looked from me to Evan and back again, his eyes searching for some explanation that would restore the certainty he had been carrying for years. But twins leave very little room for explanation when they stand side by side. Evan stopped a few feet behind him and folded his arms calmly. His posture looked stronger now than it had the night before, steadier in the daylight of the yard that had once been his responsibility. Good morning, Tyler, he said. The words were simple, but their meaning cut through every assumption Tyler had built over the last 4 years. Tyler slowly stepped backward, his attention still shifting between our identical faces. The folder of papers slipped slightly in his hand as his grip loosened. The conversation he believed he controlled had ended the moment the second voice entered the yard. Evan took one more step forward, the cottonwood leaves whispering softly in the wind behind him. You said the town believes a certain story, he continued calmly. That the land is already moving toward a new future. Tyler opened his mouth as if trying to respond, but no words arrived. Evan glanced briefly at me before looking back at his son. You are right about one thing, he said. Stories matter. He paused just long enough for the silence to settle around the three of us standing in the doorway of that shed. And now, Evan finished quietly, everyone is finally going to hear the real one.